It started with a missing student report that nobody took seriously. Sarah Chun, a sophomore at Riverside University, hadn't been seen in her dorm for 3 days. Her roommate assumed she'd gone home for the weekend. The RA figured she was staying with friends off campus. Even campus security marked it as routine. College students disappear and reappear constantly. But in the basement of the university library, behind rows of dusty academic journals and forgotten dissertations, someone was paying very close attention to every missing person report that crossed the campus news feed. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we continue this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. Margaret Stone had worked at Riverside University Library for 7 years. She arrived each morning at 7:30 a.m., unlocked the reference section, and spent her days helping students find obscure sources for their research papers. She wore cardigans that had seen better decades, kept her graying hair in a practical bun, and spoke in the kind of soft voice that never disturbed the sacred silence of academic study. Students loved her. She had an uncanny ability to recommend exactly the right book at the right time. Need sources on post-war economics? Margaret knew a 1947 dissertation that nobody else had discovered. Struggling with a psychology paper on trauma responses? She'd quietly slide you a collection of case studies that would make your professor take notice. "How does she always know?" whispered Jake Morrison, a junior who'd been saved by Margaret's recommendations 3 semesters running. His friend Tony shrugged. "She's been here forever. Probably read every book in the place." They had no idea how right they were about the reading or how wrong they were about everything else that Margaret's desk sat in the corner of the main reference area, positioned with perfect sightlines to all 3 entrances. Students assumed she'd chosen the spot for convenience. They didn't notice how she tracked every person who entered, how her eyes automatically cataloged faces, posture, and behavioral patterns. They didn't realize that someone who processes information for a living develops habits that go far beyond recommending textbooks. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in October. Margaret was re-shelving return books when she noticed Dr. Vladimir Petrov, a visiting professor from the Eastern European Studies program, photocopying what appeared to be student ID photos. Not unusual in itself. Professors often needed photos for attendance records or identification purposes. But Petrov was copying them from the campus directory rather than collecting them through official channels. Margaret noted the time, the specific photos he'd selected, and the fact that he'd chosen the isolated third-floor copy machine rather than the more convenient ones on the main level. She filed this information away with the same methodical precision she brought to organizing card catalog point 2 days later. Sarah Chun was reported missing. Margaret pulled up the campus directory that night after the library closed. Sarah Chun's photo matched one of the images she'd seen Petrov copying. She cross-referenced the other photos. Maria Santos Jr., International Studies major. David Kim, sophomore, computer science. Elena Volkov, graduate student. Political science point 4 students. All from different academic programs. All with one thing in common. They'd each visited the library's International Documents collection in the past month, requesting access to materials that required special clearance. Margaret sat in her empty office, staring at the names on her screen. Another librarian might have called campus security. A concerned citizen might have contacted the police. But Margaret Stone wasn't just any librarian, and her instincts had been honed by years of training that had nothing to do with library science. She opened her laptop and began typing, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd written countless intelligence reports. But instead of routing her analysis through official channels, she sent it to an encrypted email address that hadn't been used in 5 years. The response came within 6 hours. "Stand down. Too risky. Local authorities can handle." Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. She'd spent 7 years in quiet retirement, helping students find the information they needed for their papers. But some information was too dangerous to ignore, and some people too dangerous to underestimate.
Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thumbs up, you can help more people hear this story by liking this video. Bell, every week we share unforgettable stories of silent heroes.
The next morning, she arrived at the library early and began her own investigation. Dr. Petrov had been at Riverside for 6 months, brought in through the International Exchange Program to teach courses on post-Soviet political structures. His credentials were impeccable: degree from Moscow State University, published research on political transitions, glowing recommendations from colleagues at the University of Prague. But Margaret knew how to read between the lines of an academic CV, the gaps between positions that were explained away as research sabbaticals, the publications that existed but were difficult to verify, the references who vouched for him but whose own backgrounds were similarly opaque. Using skills she'd hoped never to need again, Margaret began building a profile. She tracked Petrov's movements around campus, noted his interactions with students, and paid particular attention to which materials he accessed from the international collection. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Petrov wasn't just photocopying student IDs. He was specifically targeting students who'd accessed classified government documents as part of their research, documents that were supposed to be restricted to graduate-level work and above. Students who might have seen information they weren't meant to see. Sarah Chun had been researching human trafficking networks for her criminology thesis. Maria Santos was working on a project about money laundering in international development aid. David Kim had accessed cybersecurity protocols for a computer science assignment. Elena Volkov was studying organized crime structures in Eastern Europe. Each student had legitimately accessed sensitive materials as part of their academic work. But someone was systematically identifying which students had seen which documents, and now they were disappearing. Margaret understood with horrifying clarity that she was looking at a recruitment operation, or worse, a silencing operation. That evening, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for official channels to take action, she decided to force the issue. She stayed late in the library, waiting until the building was officially closed. Then she made her way to Petrov's office in the Eastern European Studies building. Breaking and entering wasn't part of standard library training, but it was definitely part of her previous education. Petrov's office looked exactly like what you'd expect from a visiting professor. Books in multiple languages, academic papers scattered across his desk, photos of scholarly conferences. But Margaret knew what to look for beyond the surface and the bottom drawer of his desk. Hidden behind a stack of student papers, she found a list of names, 23 students in total, with detailed profiles of their research interests, family backgrounds, and financial situations. Sarah Chen's name was at the top, with a red check mark beside it. Margaret photographed the list with a small camera she retrieved from her apartment, then carefully returned everything to its original position. As she prepared to leave, she heard footsteps in the hallway. She had perhaps 30 seconds to exit the office and find somewhere to hide before whoever was coming would discover her presence. Moving with the silent efficiency of someone who'd been trained for exactly this type of situation, Margaret slipped out of the office and into the supply closet across the hall. Through the slightly open door, she watched Dr. Petrov enter his office with 2 men she didn't recognize. They spoke in low voices, but Margaret's Russian was good enough to understand the conversation. The Chin girl was more problematic than expected. One of the men said she'd already shared her research with her advisor. What about the others on the list? Petrov asked. Santos and Kim are being handled tonight. Volkov is proving difficult to locate. Margaret's blood ran cold. Handled was not a word that suggested these students were simply being recruited for legitimate purposes. She waited until the men left, then made her way back to the library through the underground tunnels that connected the academic buildings. Once in her office, she began making calls to numbers she'd memorized years ago but hoped never to use. The first 3 calls went to voicemail. The 4th was answered by a voice she hadn't heard in 7 years. Stone? Jesus Christ, we thought you were dead. I need immediate extraction support from multiple civilians, Margaret said without preamble. And I need it tonight. Margaret, you've been out of the game for a dash. Agent Rodriguez, this is not a request. I have 3 students who are about to be killed by a foreign operation on American soil. You can either help me save them, or you can explain to Congress why you let a former CIA analyst handle it alone. There was a pause. What do you need? Margaret spent the next hour coordinating with her former colleagues, while simultaneously trying to locate the 3 remaining students on Petrov's list. Maria Santos was in her dorm room, unaware of the danger. David Kim was at the computer lab, working late on a project. Elena Volkov was nowhere to be found. At 11 p.m., Margaret made a decision that would blow her cover forever. She activated the campus emergency alert system. Campus security alert. All students in the following list should report immediately to the campus police station for their safety. She read out the names of the remaining students on Petrov's list. This is not a drill. Your safety is in immediate danger. Within minutes, her phone was ringing. Campus security, confused and demanding explanations. Students calling the library, asking if the mild-mannered librarian who'd sent the alert was having some kind of breakdown. Margaret ignored all of it. She had work to do, using the campus security cameras, access she quietly maintained through her work with the digital archives. She tracked the locations of Petrov and his associates. They were moving fast now, their timeline accelerated by the emergency alert. She watched as they approached Maria Santos' dorm, only to find it surrounded by confused but alert campus security officers. The students were being evacuated to the police station, exactly as Margaret had intended. But Elena Volkov was still missing. Margaret had one advantage that Petrov didn't know about. She'd been watching him for days and had identified his patterns. He had a preferred route through campus, specific locations where he felt secure, and a tendency to use the library's after-hours access for meetings at 1 a.m. She received confirmation that Elena Volkov was being held in the library's storage basement, the one area Margaret knew better than anyone else in the building. Margaret Stone, the librarian, would have called for backup and waited for professional help. But Margaret Stone, the CIA analyst, understood that sometimes you have to act on incomplete information with insufficient resources. She made her way to the basement, moving through the stacks with the silence of someone who'd spent 7 years learning every creaking floorboard and squeaky hinge. The storage area was in the sub-basement, accessible only through a maintenance entrance that required both a key card and a physical key. Margaret had both. She found Elena Volkov tied to a chair in the archive storage room, conscious but terrified. 2 of Petrov's associates were standing guard, but they were facing the main entrance, not expecting someone to arrive through the maintenance tunnels. Margaret had about 30 seconds to assess the situation before she had to act. 2 armed men, 1 civilian protect, limited cover, and no backup for at least 10 minutes. She'd been trained for this exact scenario 20 years ago. The training had never really left. What happened next was over in less than 60 seconds. Margaret Stone, the quiet librarian who helped students find research materials, neutralized 2 armed operatives with the kind of precision that only comes from extensive training and muscle memory that never completely fades. Elena Volkov would later tell investigators that she'd never seen anything like it. The woman who'd helped her find sources for her thesis on organized crime had just demonstrated a very practical understanding of the subject. When campus security and the FBI arrived 10 minutes later, they found Margaret calmly untying Elena while the 2 unconscious operatives were zip-tied with library cable management strips. "Ma'am," the lead FBI agent said, clearly confused by the scene, "can you explain what happened here?" Margaret looked up from checking Elena's condition. "I believe you'll find that Dr. Vladimir Petrov has been running a foreign intelligence operation on this campus, targeting students who had access to sensitive research materials. And you are Margaret Stone. I'm the reference librarian." The agent stared at her, then at the unconscious operatives, then back at her. "Ma'am, with all due respect, librarians don't typically—" "Agent Morrison," Margaret interrupted, reading his badge, "I suggest you run my name through your database, but check the classified files. And you might want to use my previous surname, Margaret Stone Volkov." The agent's expression changed immediately. Margaret Stone Volkov was a legend in intelligence circles, a CIA analyst who'd spent 15 years tracking international criminal networks before disappearing into retirement. But she'd been presumed dead after a mission went wrong in Prague. "Agent Stone Volkov," the agent said, his tone completely different now. "We thought you were killed in the Prague operation." "I was," Margaret said simply. "Margaret Stone Volkov died in Prague 7 years ago. Margaret Stone, the librarian, was born the next day." Over the next several hours, the full scope of the operation became clear. Petrov had been running a recruitment and intelligence gathering operation, Identify American students who might be useful assets or who would access information that could compromise ongoing operations. Sarah Chun had been taken because her research had uncovered connections between human trafficking networks and legitimate businesses, connections that certain people prefer remain hidden. The FBI raid on Petrov's off-campus safe house resulted in the rescue of Sarah Chun and the arrest of 6 additional operatives. The international implications of the case would keep investigators busy for months. But Margaret Stone was done with investigations 2 weeks later. She sat in the office of University President Dr. Patricia Williams, officially submitting her resignation. "Margaret, I have to ask," Dr. Williams said, "did you know this was going to happen when you took the job here?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I knew that someone with my background would eventually be found, no matter how deeply I tried to disappear. I hoped it would be my own people rather than hostiles, but I was prepared for either possibility. And the students? Was helping them with their research part of some kind of cover?" "No," Margaret said, and for the first time in the conversation, she smiled. "That was real. I genuinely enjoyed helping them find the information they needed. It was peaceful." Dr. Williams studied her for a moment. "The FBI says you're being reassigned to a classified position, but they also said you could stay here if you wanted to. The choice is yours." Margaret looked out the window at the campus where she'd spent 7 quiet years. Students were walking to classes, carrying backpacks full of books, heading to the library where a new reference librarian would soon help them find the sources they needed for their papers. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "it's time for Margaret Stone, the librarian, to retire. She's earned it." 3 months later, Sarah Chen was back on campus, finishing her thesis on human trafficking networks. Her advisor had suggested she might want to change topics after her ordeal, but Sarah had refused. If anything, her experience had given her a deeper understanding of how these networks operated and why they needed to be exposed. She was working late in the library when she noticed a new reference librarian had been hired. The woman was younger than Margaret Stone, with dark hair and a warm smile, but she had the same uncanny ability to recommend exactly the right sources at the right time. "Excuse me," Sarah said, approaching the reference desk. "I'm looking for information about witness protection programs for trafficking victims. It's for my thesis." The new librarian looked up, and for just a moment, Sarah saw something familiar in her eyes. Not the same person, but the same awareness, the same sense that this was someone who understood more than she was saying. "I think I can help you with that," the librarian said, pulling out a card catalog with practice efficiency. "Let me find you some sources that might be useful." As Sarah walked away with a stack of precisely relevant materials, she couldn't shake the feeling that Riverside University Library had a very specific type of librarian. The kind who knew exactly what information students needed, and who would go to extraordinary lengths to protect those students from information that was too dangerous to know. She never saw Margaret Stone again, but sometimes Sarah wondered if the quiet woman who'd helped her find sources for so many papers had known all along that the most important research she'd ever do would be the kind that saved lives. Margaret Stone Volkov, meanwhile, was somewhere else entirely, using a different name and a different cover identity, but still doing what she'd always done best, finding the information that mattered and protecting the people who needed protection. Because some people are always around, watching and protecting. You just don't see them unless you know how to look. And sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who look perfectly ordinary, sitting behind a reference desk, helping students find exactly what they need to know. This story was brought to you by The Human Stories. Have you ever met someone who seemed perfectly ordinary but turned out to be extraordinary? Tell us in the comments about the people who surprised you with their hidden depths. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.